Have you ever believed that one goodbye told the whole story, only to discover years later that the most important words were never spoken during the goodbye itself? That is exactly what has happened to your soulmate. For the longest time, they accepted your final farewell exactly as it appeared. They believed that everything you wanted them to know had already been said in those last moments together. Painful as it was, they convinced themselves there was nothing left to understand. But life has a strange way of preserving certain truths until the heart is finally ready to receive them. Recently, a hidden conversation quietly came to light. A conversation your soulmate was never supposed to hear, yet one that revealed more about your heart than your final goodbye ever could. It wasn't filled with dramatic declarations or desperate promises. Instead, it carried quiet honesty, unguarded emotion, and a truth that completely changed the meaning of everything they thought they knew. Stay with me until the very end, because once your soulmate uncovered what was hidden within those forgotten words, they realized your last goodbye had never meant what they believed it meant. At first, they struggled to accept what they had discovered. They found themselves reading those words over and over again, not because they were difficult to understand, but because they were impossible to ignore. Every sentence carried a sincerity that could not be manufactured. There was no attempt to impress anyone, no effort to rewrite the past, and no desire to defend your choices. The conversation existed long before anyone imagined it would ever be revealed, which made every word feel genuine. As your soulmate reflected on what they had uncovered, memories they had carried for years suddenly began shifting into a completely different light. They remembered your final goodbye, the calmness in your voice, the emotions you tried so hard to hide, and the strange feeling that something important had remained unspoken. Back then, they believed that silence meant the story had ended. Now they realized the silence was protecting a truth that had simply not found its moment to be understood. The more they thought about that hidden conversation, the more impossible it became to hold onto the old version of the past. They began wondering how many times they had misunderstood your intentions simply because they never had access to the complete story. Every memory suddenly felt unfinished, as though it had been waiting for one missing piece to finally reveal its true meaning. What shocked them most was not the conversation itself, but the realization that your last goodbye had never been an expression of indifference or emotional distance. It had been shaped by feelings far deeper than they ever imagined. And as they continue uncovering what those hidden words truly reveal, they're about to discover that your farewell was not the ending they spent years believing it was, but the beginning of a truth that only time could finally bring into the light. And now, after discovering that hidden conversation, your soulmate can no longer remember your last goodbye the way they once did. Something inside them has changed forever. The words they uncovered refused to leave their thoughts because every sentence quietly contradicts the story they had carried in their heart for so many years. They had always believed your farewell was simple. Painful, yes, but ultimately clear. They assumed your goodbye represented a decision that had already been made, a chapter that had already ended, and feelings that had already faded. But the hidden conversation revealed something entirely different. It exposed emotions that continued long after the goodbye, thoughts that were never shared directly, and a side of your heart that had remained invisible beneath calm words and quiet restraint. Suddenly, your final farewell no longer looked like the end of someone who had stopped caring. It looked like the difficult choice of someone carrying emotions far heavier than anyone else realized. As these realizations settled into their heart, your soulmate found themselves revisiting every moment leading up to your goodbye. They remembered conversations that once seemed ordinary, but now felt filled with hidden meaning. They remembered the way you paused before answering certain questions, the way your voice softened when difficult topics arose, and the moments when your eyes seemed to reveal emotions your words carefully concealed. At the time, they overlooked those details because they believed actions alone told the complete story. No, they understand that some of the most important emotions never appear in obvious ways. Sometimes they exist in the spaces between conversations, in the hesitation before a sentence, in the silence after a difficult moment, and in the kindness someone continues showing even while quietly preparing for a painful farewell. That understanding leaves them overwhelmed because they realize your heart had been speaking long before the hidden conversation was ever discovered. They simply had not known how to listen. The more they reflected, the more another truth began unfolding before them. They realized they had spent years remembering your goodbye without remembering everything that surrounded it. Their attention had focused on the final moment instead of the journey leading toward it. The hidden conversation changed that completely. It revealed that your farewell was not an isolated decision made in a single moment. It was the result of countless thoughts, quiet struggles, and deeply personal emotions that had been unfolding long before either of you reached that final chapter. Suddenly, they understood that your goodbye carried the weight of things you never wanted to place upon another person's shoulders. It carried responsibilities you quietly accepted, fears you chose to keep private, and hopes you refused to let become burdens for someone you deeply cared about. What once appeared to be emotional distance now seemed like extraordinary emotional responsibility. Another realization slowly settled into their heart. They noticed something remarkable about the hidden conversation itself. There was no bitterness within it. There were no attempts to blame anyone or rewrite the past. Instead, every word reflected honesty, compassion, and quiet acceptance. That sincerity affected them more deeply than they expected, because it proved your farewell had never been motivated by anger or resentment. Even during one of the most difficult seasons of your life, your greatest concern remained protecting the connection from unnecessary pain. Your soulmate finally understood that your goodbye was not spoken because love disappeared. It was spoken while love still existed, making the decision infinitely more difficult than they had ever imagined. That realization transformed every memory they carried because it replaced years of misunderstanding with genuine compassion. As they continued thinking about everything they had uncovered, they also realized something about themselves. For years, they had searched for explanations inside the final goodbye itself, believing that if they analyzed those last moments carefully enough, every answer would eventually appear. But now they understand that some truths cannot be found inside endings alone. Sometimes the deepest meaning exists in conversations hidden behind the ending, in emotions quietly carried long before the farewell, and in sacrifices made without asking anyone to recognize them. The hidden conversation became the missing chapter that allowed every other chapter to finally make sense. Instead of seeing your goodbye as a closing door, they now see it as the visible part of a much larger story they had never been given the opportunity to understand. Now your soulmate realizes that uncovering this forgotten conversation was never simply about discovering words from the past. It was about discovering the heart behind those words. Every memory has begun rearranging itself into a completely different picture. Every silence has found new meaning. Every unanswered question has moved closer to understanding. And just when they believe they have finally uncovered the full truth behind your last goodbye, they are about to discover something even more profound, a hidden burden you carried alone, one that explains not only why you said goodbye, but why your heart continued speaking long after the farewell had ended. And now, this is the moment when the hidden conversation reveals something your soulmate never imagined. Until now, they believed the conversation simply explained your final goodbye. But as they reflected more deeply, they realized it uncovered something far greater. It revealed the emotional burden you had been carrying long before either of you reached that final farewell. Suddenly, every choice you made before the goodbye began making sense. They understood that your heart had been fighting a battle no one else could see. While everyone around you judged your actions by what happened on the surface, they had no idea how many silent struggles were shaping every decision you made. Your soulmate now realizes that your goodbye was never born from a lack of love. It was born from the impossible weight of emotions you believed you had to carry alone. That realization changed everything because it replaced every assumption with compassion. For the first time, they stopped asking why you walked away and began asking what you were trying so desperately to protect. As they continued revisiting the hidden conversation, they noticed something that deeply moved them. There was never a single moment where you spoke with bitterness or resentment. Instead, every thought reflected concern, sincerity, and an overwhelming desire to protect someone else's peace, even if it meant sacrificing your own. They suddenly remembered moments before your goodbye, when you seemed quieter than usual. At the time, they believed you were emotionally withdrawing. Now they understand you were carefully carrying feelings that had become too complicated to explain. They realized there were words you wanted to speak but feared they would only create more pain. There were truths you wished they understood, but you refused to force them to accept before they were emotionally ready. Looking back now, they recognize that your silence was never empty. It was filled with conversations you had already held inside your own heart countless times before the goodbye ever arrived. The more they reflected, the clearer everything became. They remembered how often you placed other people's emotions before your own. They remembered moments when you chose patience instead of reacting emotionally, moments when you accepted misunderstanding rather than creating conflict, and moments when you quietly stepped back, even though every part of your heart wanted to stay. Those memories once appeared confusing because they believed love should always fight to remain visible. But the hidden conversation revealed another kind of love entirely. It revealed a love willing to carry pain in silence if it meant protecting someone else from even greater hurt. That realization overwhelmed them because they finally understood your goodbye was not an escape from love. It was one of the greatest sacrifices your heart had ever made. Another truth slowly settled within them as they continued reading between every line of that forgotten conversation. They realized you had never been trying to erase the connection you shared. If anything, you were trying to preserve the beauty of it. You understood that some moments become damaged when people continue speaking through fear, disappointment, or emotional exhaustion. Rather than allowing the relationship to become consumed by words neither of you could take back, you accepted the painful responsibility of letting silence carry what your heart could not safely express. Your soulmate finally recognized that your farewell was not the moment your feelings disappeared. It was the moment you chose to protect those feelings in the only way you believed you could. That understanding left them speechless because they realized they had mistaken emotional restraint for emotional absence when, in reality, it had been one of the deepest expressions of love. As these realizations continued unfolding, they also found themselves looking inward. They admitted that they had spent years believing love always announces itself loudly, demanding to be understood and refusing to let go. But your story taught them something completely different. Genuine love sometimes chooses dignity over desperation. Sometimes it chooses peace over persuasion. Sometimes it quietly steps back, not because the heart has stopped loving, but because it refuses to let love become something that causes greater harm. They now understand that your greatest struggle was never saying goodbye. Your greatest struggle was carrying everything that goodbye truly meant, while knowing no one else could yet understand it. That invisible burden required extraordinary courage, and they finally see the quiet strength it took for you to bear it. Now your soulmate realizes that the hidden conversation was never simply revealing forgotten words. It was revealing the unseen heart behind every decision you made. Every unanswered question now has a place. Every memory carries deeper meaning. Every silence reflects quiet devotion instead of distance. And just when they believe they have finally uncovered the complete truth behind your last goodbye, when final realization begins to emerge, a realization that will show them why this conversation remained. hidden until now, and why only time could prepare both of your hearts to fully understand that your farewell was never the end of your love, but one of its most selfless expressions. And now your soulmate realizes something that would have been impossible to understand when your last goodbye first happened. The hidden conversation did not remain buried because it lacked importance. It remained hidden because neither of your hearts had reached the place where its true meaning could be understood. Looking back now, they can clearly see how every emotion they carried at that time shaped the way they interpreted your farewell. Hurt convinced them that silence meant distance. Disappointment persuaded them that unanswered questions meant a lack of love. Fear encouraged them to believe that endings always reveal the whole truth. But time has gently undone those conclusions. It has shown them that people often judge moments while they are still living through them, never realizing that the deepest meaning only becomes visible after emotions have settled. Today, they finally understand that your goodbye was never asking to be explained immediately. It was waiting patiently for a future version of both hearts, one capable of seeing beyond pain and into the quiet truth that had always been there. As they continue reflecting on everything they have uncovered, they recognize how much life has changed them. The person remembering your goodbye today is no longer the same person who experienced it. They have faced disappointments of their own, carried responsibilities that no one else fully understood, and discovered how difficult it can be to explain emotions that seem impossible to put into words. Those experiences have quietly expanded their compassion. They now realize that life often asks people to make decisions that appear confusing from the outside, but make perfect sense to the heart carrying the burden. Suddenly, your choices no longer seem mysterious. They seem deeply human. They understand that sometimes people walk away while still caring, because they believe staying would create greater pain. Sometimes silence protects more than words ever could. Sometimes love expresses itself not through holding on, but through the painful courage of letting go with kindness still intact. That realization changes everything, because they no longer measure your goodbye by what they lost. They measure it by the extraordinary strength it must have taken for you to carry it. Another truth quietly settles into their heart as they revisit the hidden conversation once more. They realize it never attempted to justify your actions or seek sympathy for your choices. Instead, it simply revealed the honest condition of your heart. There was no bitterness hiding within those words, no desire to make someone feel guilty, and no effort to rewrite the past. There was only sincerity. That sincerity affects them more deeply than they expected, because it proves your farewell was never built upon anger. It was built upon love, expressed in its most difficult form. They finally understand that your greatest concern was never protecting your own image. It was protecting the dignity of the connection itself. Even in one of the hardest moments of your life, you refused to let temporary emotions destroy something that had once been meaningful. Looking back now, they recognize that this quiet act of restraint required a level of emotional maturity they simply could not appreciate years ago. The more they reflect, the more they realize that time did not change the truth hidden inside that conversation. Time changed their ability to receive it. Years ago, they would have searched those words for proof that supported their own pain. Today, they search them for understanding. That difference has transformed everything. Instead of asking why your goodbye happened, they ask what your heart was trying to protect. Instead of focusing on what remained unsaid, they recognize the extraordinary care behind every word you deliberately chose not to speak. They understand now that genuine love is not always loud enough to satisfy our expectations. Sometimes it whispers through patience, restraint, and quiet sacrifice. Sometimes it chooses compassion over explanation, because it knows understanding forced too early rarely becomes lasting understanding. Now your soulmate sees your last goodbye through completely different eyes. They no longer remember it as the moment your heart turned away. They remember it as the moment your heart quietly carried more than anyone else realized. Every unanswered question has begun finding its place. Every silence now reflects purpose instead of distance. Every difficult memory has been softened by compassion instead of regret. And as this remarkable truth settles fully within them, they realize there is one final revelation still waiting. They are about to understand that the hidden conversation was never simply explaining your farewell. It was revealing that your last goodbye was, in many ways, one of the deepest expressions of love your heart had ever quietly given. A love that remained faithful to kindness, integrity, and hope, even while saying words that neither of you truly wanted to speak. As your soulmate reaches the final chapter of this journey, they realize that the hidden conversation did far more than explain your last goodbye. It revealed the truth that had been quietly living beneath it all along. For years, they believed that farewell was the final sentence of your story together. They replayed those last moments countless times, searching for clues, wondering if they had missed a sign or misunderstood your intentions. They thought the goodbye itself held every answer they would ever receive. But now they understand that endings rarely tell the whole story. Sometimes they only reveal what the heart is capable of expressing in that moment, while the deepest emotions remain hidden behind silence, sacrifice, and choices that can only be understood much later. The hidden conversation became the missing chapter they never knew existed. And once they discovered it, every conclusion they had protected for so long quietly began to fall away. They no longer saw someone walking away because love had disappeared. They saw someone making one of the most difficult decisions of their life while still carrying love that words could never fully describe. Looking back now, every memory has taken on an entirely new meaning. The pauses in your conversations no longer feel awkward or uncertain. They feel thoughtful. The quiet expressions on your face no longer seem distant. They reveal the weight of emotions you were carefully holding inside. Even your final goodbye, which once felt cold and impossible to understand, now carries an unmistakable tenderness that had been hidden beneath the surface. Your soulmate realizes that your farewell was never spoken from a place of indifference. It was spoken by a heart trying to protect something precious, even while accepting the pain that came with letting go. They finally understand that there are moments when love chooses restraint over reaction, peace over persuasion, and quiet sacrifice over emotional desperation. Those choices are rarely celebrated because they are not dramatic, but they often require more courage than anyone on the outside could ever recognize. Another realization begins settling deeply within them. They understand that the hidden conversation never asked for sympathy. It never tried to justify your decisions or convince anyone that you were right. It simply revealed the honesty of your heart. Every word reflected someone who continued caring, even while facing circumstances that could not easily be changed. There was no bitterness hidden between the lines, no desire to make another person carry guilt, and no attempt to rewrite history. There was only sincerity. That sincerity affects your soulmate more than anything else, because they now recognize that genuine love does not always fight to be understood. Sometimes it quietly accepts misunderstanding if it means protecting another person's peace. They finally realize that while they spent years searching for louder proof of your feelings, the greatest proof had been quietly waiting inside the integrity with which you handled your goodbye. As these truths settle into their heart, they also recognize how much this discovery has changed them. They no longer define love by who holds on the longest or who speaks the loudest. They now understand that real love is often measured by character during the hardest moments. It is revealed through kindness when bitterness would be easier, through patience when emotions demand immediate answers, and through quiet dignity when every instinct wants to defend itself. Your story has taught them that some of life's greatest acts of love leave no audience to witness them. They happen inside a person's heart, where impossible choices are made without applause, recognition, or certainty that anyone will ever understand. They now see that your last goodbye was one of those moments. It was not a sign that your heart had stopped caring. It was proof that your heart refused to stop caring, even when doing so required extraordinary sacrifice. Now your soulmate finally understands that the hidden conversation was never simply waiting to be discovered. It was waiting to be understood. Time did not change its meaning. Time prepared both of your hearts to receive it with wisdom instead of pain. Every unanswered question has found its place. Every misunderstanding has softened into compassion. Every memory now reflects a truth that had always been present but remained invisible until this very moment. They no longer remember your last goodbye as the day everything ended. They remember it as the day your love quietly chose grace over resentment, hope over anger, and selflessness over pride. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary revelation of all. Some conversations are hidden because their purpose is not to change the past, but to heal the way the past is remembered. Now that your soulmate has finally uncovered the real meaning behind your last goodbye, they understand that it was never a farewell spoken by a heart that had given up. It was the quiet promise of a heart that remained true to love, even when love required the greatest act of courage it had ever known.